In Victorian England, when death visited a family, only one way remained to preserve forever the memory of a beloved, a final photograph. But some images guard secrets that transcend death itself. This is the story of a photograph that should have been a last farewell, but became evidence of one of the most disturbing mysteries of Victorian medicine. The photograph we observe was taken on November 15, 1858, one day after the sudden death of Herbert Prescott, only 16 years old. What we see is George Prescott, then 9 years old, posing solemnly beside his older brother, Herbert Prescott, who lies apparently in eternal peace in an elegant Victorian armchair. A touching scene of family farewell that hides a terrifying truth discovered decades later. Herbert Prescott was not just George's older brother. At 16, he had assumed responsibilities far beyond his age, becoming a father figure to his younger brother after their father's tragic death in a carriage accident 3 years earlier. Their mother, Victoria Prescott, a woman of fragile temperament, had never fully recovered from her husband's loss and frequently withdrew for long periods, leaving Herbert as the true guardian of the family's welfare. Despite his youth, Herbert worked as an accounting apprentice at a respectable firm in central London, a position he had secured due to his exceptional intelligence and precocious maturity. Neighbors described him as a young man of robust health and impressive determination, who had never shown signs of any serious illness. On the morning of November 14th, Herbert awoke apparently well. He took his usual breakfast, chatted briefly with George about preparations for the approaching winter, and retired to his quarters, saying he felt slightly fatigued. George, occupied with his daily lessons, didn't think much about his brother's apparently normal behavior. For a 9-year-old child who had lost his father so young and lived with a mother frequently absent in her own grief, Herbert's comforting presence represented all the family stability he knew. It was only at nightfall, when Herbert didn't come down for dinner, that George went upstairs to check on his condition. What he found would change his life forever. Herbert was lying in his bed, motionless, with a serene expression on his face, as if he had simply fallen asleep and chosen never to wake again. The local doctor, Dr. Frederick Hastings, was immediately called. Hastings, educated at the prestigious University of Edinburgh, had attended the Prescott family for years and knew well the medical history of both brothers. His analysis was conclusive and bewildering. Herbert Prescott was dead, but there were no evident signs of any specific cause. The examination revealed that the heart had stopped, but there were no indications of previous heart disease. There were no signs of poisoning, wounds, or any physical trauma. Body temperature had decreased naturally. Rigor mortis was setting in as expected, and all vital signs were absent. For all practical and medical purposes, Herbert Prescott had experienced what Victorian doctors called natural death, a term that frequently masked the limitations of medical knowledge of the era. Dr. Hastings recorded in the death certificate, "Sudden death by indeterminate natural cause. Absence of vital signs confirmed. I recommend burial within 48 hours according to sanitary protocol." In Victorian England, it was common to photograph the dead, especially when dealing with young family members. These post-mortem photographs, known as memento mori, served as final remembrances and were often the only image the family would possess of their loved one. Victoria Prescott, still devastated by the loss, found herself unable to make any decisions about Herbert's final arrangements. It was James Morland, a close family friend and respected photographer in the community, who gently suggested and offered to create a final image of young Herbert. Morland knew the Prescott family's difficult situation and wished to offer this final gesture of support to the bereaved widow and fatherless children. Morland was known in the region for his ability to create dignified and respectful post-mortem portraits. He arrived at the Prescott residence the following morning, carrying his heavy equipment and glass plates necessary for the photographic process of the era. The daguerreotype, the dominant photographic process in 1858, required long exposure times and careful positioning of subjects. The photographic session was meticulously planned. Herbert was positioned in his favorite armchair, wearing his best suit, with an expression that Morland skillfully managed to make serene and dignified. George was positioned alongside, one hand gently resting on his deceased brother's shoulder, creating an image that would convey both sadness and acceptance. What no one could imagine at the time was that this photograph would become crucial, evidence of a medical mystery that would only be unraveled almost 6 decades later. Moreland noticed something peculiar during the session. In his personal notes, discovered much later in his studio, he wrote, "The deceased subject presented a slightly more rosy facial coloration than usual in similar cases. I attributed it to good previous circulation and the brief time elapsed since death. Herbert Prescott was buried in the local cemetery on November 16, 1858, just 2 days after his sudden death. The funeral was simple but respectful, with the attendance of some neighbors and work colleagues. George, still in shock from the sudden loss, remained beside the grave until earth completely covered the oak coffin that sheltered his brother's mortal remains. The following years were difficult for the Prescott family. Victoria, devastated by the double loss, withdrew even further into her silent grief, often spending entire days in her quarters. George grew up under the intermittent care of his grieving mother and the kindness of compassionate neighbors. But it was James Moreland who became a constant paternal figure in his life, regularly checking on the family's welfare and offering practical support whenever necessary. Herbert's photograph became the family's most precious possession. Carefully kept framed in the living room, it was a silent reminder of lost stability. George grew up, married Sarah Cavanaugh, had children, and eventually became a respected merchant in the community. Herbert's photograph remained always present in his living room, a constant reminder of the brother he had lost so young and so mysteriously. When George died in 1923 at age 74, his children inherited not only his material possessions, but also the family stories he had carefully preserved throughout the decades. Among these stories was the detailed narrative about Herbert's mysterious death and the circumstances surrounding that final photograph. It was only in 1919, during renovation work at the local cemetery to accommodate the bodies of soldiers killed in World War I, that Herbert Prescott's mystery began to reveal itself in a terrifying way. Dr. Horace Fairchild, a pioneering forensic pathologist who had studied the latest medical investigation techniques in France, was contracted to supervise the exhumation of various bodies that needed to be transferred to a new section of the cemetery. Among these bodies was Herbert Prescott's, which had remained buried for more than 6 decades. What Dr. Fairchild discovered when the coffin was opened defied all expectations and cast a sinister light on the events of 1858. The oak coffin, surprisingly well preserved due to the wood's quality and specific soil conditions, revealed evidence that transformed an apparently natural death into one of the most disturbing cases in forensic medical literature. Dr. Fairchild's discoveries were meticulously documented in his official report, preserved in the Royal Institute of Medicine of London's archives. The interior of the coffin lid showed unmistakable marks of deep scratches, clearly created by human nails. Even more disturbing, the skeleton's position had changed significantly since the original burial. While Herbert had been carefully buried positioned on his back with arms crossed over his chest, according to tradition, the skeleton was found in a position that suggested desperate struggle. The arms were extended toward the coffin lid, and fragments of funeral clothing were scattered, in a way that indicated violent movement. More detailed analysis revealed that the phalanges of both hands showed fractures consistent with desperate escape attempts. Dr. Fairchild noted that the wear on the finger bones was characteristic of prolonged digging against a hard surface, and small wood fragments remained embedded under what remained of the nails. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the skull's condition. Contrary to what would be expected in a case of natural death followed by immediate burial, the skull showed signs of internal trauma that could only have occurred after burial. Extremely elevated arterial pressure, possibly caused by panic and despair, had resulted in small fractures at the skull's base. Dr. Fairchild concluded in his report, "The evidence is unequivocal. Herbert Prescott was not dead when he was buried. He experienced a state of suspended animation that was erroneously diagnosed as death by the medical standards of 1858. The subject regained consciousness inside the coffin and fought desperately for his freedom before succumbing to asphyxiation and exhaustion." This revelation cast new light on the photograph taken by James Moreland. Modern experts in historical photography, when consulted about the image, noticed details that had gone unnoticed for decades. The slightly more rosy facial coloration that Moreland had observed was in fact indicative of still active blood circulation. Even more significant, careful analysis of the photograph revealed something that chilled investigators' blood. By digitally magnifying the image of Herbert's eyes, it's possible to observe that the eyelids were not completely closed, and there's a subtle muscular tension in the face that is inconsistent with true death. Victorian medicine, though advanced for its time, still lacked the diagnostic methods necessary to distinguish between actual death and states of deep coma or catalepsy. Dr. Hastings, a respected and competent physician by 1858 standards, had followed all available medical protocols, but simply didn't possess the instruments or knowledge necessary to detect extremely weak vital signs. The condition Herbert probably experienced is known today as catalepsy, a rare neurological state characterized by muscular rigidity and apparent absence of vital signs detectable by the primitive methods of the era. During cataleptic episodes, breathing can become so shallow and pulse so weak that they are virtually undetectable without modern equipment. Dr. Joseph Carraway, a modern specialist in historical forensic medicine, explained in his study of the Prescott case, catalepsy was frequently confused with death. In the pre-modern era, symptoms can persist for hours or even days, creating a terrifying situation where the patient remains conscious but unable to move or communicate. Herbert Prescott was probably aware of the entire process, from the incorrect diagnosis to the moment of burial. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond Herbert Prescott's individual case. Subsequent research in medical and cemetery records of the era revealed that similar cases may have been more common than imagined. The Victorian practice of rapid burial, motivated by valid sanitary concerns, inadvertently created conditions where diagnostic errors could have fatal consequences. The Herbert Prescott case became a landmark in forensic medical literature, being studied in medical universities as an example of historical limitations in medical diagnosis and the importance of rigorous confirmatory methods for determining death. George Prescott, who died without knowing the truth about his brother's fate, had carefully preserved all documents related to that terrible day of November 1858. Among these documents, discovered by his descendants, was a personal diary where he recorded his reflections on Herbert's sudden death. In a particularly disturbing entry dated 2 years after the burial, George wrote, "Sometimes I wake up at night thinking about Herbert. I have strange dreams where he calls to me, as if trying to tell me something important. Mother says they're just fantasies of a fatherless child, but I can't shake the feeling that something wasn't right that day. Mr. Moreland also seems restless when we visit the grave, as if he too perceives something we can't name." This intuition of George's, recorded decades before the discovery of forensic evidence, suggests that even a child had perceived something disturbing about the circumstances of Herbert's death, something his young mind couldn't clearly articulate. The Prescott brothers' photograph became one of the most studied historical documents of the Victorian period, not only for its artistic value as an example of post-mortem photography, but as inadvertent evidence of one of the most shocking cases of premature burial recorded in medical history. Medical museums around the world now display reproductions of the photograph alongside forensic discoveries, using the case as an educational tool to illustrate the evolution of medical knowledge and the importance of precise diagnostic methods. Photographer James Moreland, whose detailed notes about the session were preserved, had documented not only the technical aspects of the photography but also his personal impressions of that day. In a letter to a colleague discovered in his personal archives, he wrote, "There was something unsettling about that session. Young George seemed nervous in a way that went beyond normal grief. He kept looking at his brother as if expecting him to move. I thought it was just the strange behavior of a grieving child. But now I wonder if he had perceived something we adults ignored." The photographic techniques of 1858 required long exposures, often of several minutes. During this period, Moreland had observed George attentively, noting that the boy seemed to be murmuring something quietly, almost as if conversing with his supposedly dead brother. These observations, recorded as curiosities at the time, now take on a much more somber significance. Dr. Fairchild, in his subsequent studies of similar cases, discovered that the phenomenon of premature burial was common enough in the Victorian era to inspire the invention of various safety devices designed to allow people erroneously buried to signal from inside their coffins. These devices, which included bells connected to the surface by ropes and special ventilation tubes, were marketed as premature burial insurance and found an anxious market among families, terrified by the possibility of burying their Loved ones alive. The London company, Bateson's patent coffin. Company developed one of the most elaborate systems, including a bell mechanism activated by internal movement and a piping system that would provide fresh air to the coffin's interior for up to a week after burial. Although these devices were expensive and considered eccentric by many, some documented cases of post-burial activation suggest the fear was not completely unfounded. The Herbert Prescott case directly influenced the development of more rigorous medical protocols for death confirmation. In the 1870s, British hospitals began implementing mandatory observation periods before releasing bodies for burial, and more sophisticated confirmation methods were developed. Dr. Ernest Kavanagh, a pioneer physician in detecting weak vital signs, developed techniques that included prolonged observation of condensation on mirrors placed over nostrils and mouth, plus methods for detecting extremely weak pulses through prolonged pressure at specific body points. These medical innovations, though primitive by modern standards, represented significant advances in preventing erroneous death diagnosis and drastically reduced the incidence of premature burials. The story of the Prescott brothers also raises profound philosophical questions about the nature of death and the limits of human perception. Herbert had experienced a liminal state between life and death that defies our conventional categories of existence. His consciousness, imprisoned in a body that appeared dead to external observers, represents a type of human experience that transcends our normal understanding of the human condition. Modern studies of near-death experiences and altered states of consciousness frequently reference the Herbert Prescott case as an extreme example of how consciousness can persist even when physical signs of life are imperceptible. Some researchers suggest Herbert may have experienced a unique form of lucidity during his cataleptic period, remaining aware of his environment while unable to respond physically. The photograph continues to fascinate not only historians and doctors, but also artists and philosophers who see in the image a powerful representation of human life's fragility and the limitations of human knowledge. The serene expression on Herbert's face, captured at the exact moment between life and death, has become a symbol of the mysterious frontier that separates these two fundamental states of existence. Contemporary researchers in neuroscience have used the Herbert Prescott case as a starting point for investigations into consciousness, persistence in states of apparent clinical death. Although it's impossible to know exactly what Herbert experienced during his final moments in the coffin, forensic evidence suggests he maintained not only consciousness, but also sufficient physical strength to attempt escape for a considerable period. Dr. Mary Hastings, descendant of the doctor who originally examined Herbert, conducted an extensive study of the case using modern forensic analysis techniques. Her conclusion was that Herbert probably remained conscious for several hours after burial, fighting against confinement until the combination of asphyxiation and exhaustion finally prevailed. This modern analysis adds a terrifying dimension to the story, suggesting Herbert not only woke up inside the coffin, but maintained sufficient hope and determination to fight for his survival for a prolonged period. The nail marks on the coffin lid tell the story of a desperate struggle that lasted much longer than anyone could psychologically dare to imagine. The legacy of the Herbert Prescott case extends far beyond forensic medicine. The story became part of Victorian folklore, inspiring various Gothic fiction works and contributing to the atmosphere of mystery and morbidity that characterized the era's literature. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe, though writing before the discovery of forensic evidence, seem to have intuited the horrors of premature burial in tales like The Premature Burial and Berenice. The Herbert Prescott case, when finally revealed, confirmed that such horrors were not merely products of literary imagination, but medical realities that had tormented real families. The story's influence can also be observed in the development of more cautious funeral practices. Modern funeral homes implemented mandatory cooling periods and multiple medical confirmations before burial, partially inspired by historical cases like Herbert Prescott's. Contemporary cemeteries frequently include memorials dedicated to victims of premature burial, acknowledging that this medical tragedy affected many more families than official records ever documented. Herbert Prescott's grave became one of these unofficial memorials, visited by medical researchers and people interested in the macabre history of Victorian medicine. The Prescott brothers' photograph remains a silent testimony to an era when the boundaries between life and death were much less clear than we imagine today. Each time we observe the image, we are confronted with the reality that Herbert, apparently in serene repose, was actually experiencing the final moments of an existence that extended beyond the detection methods available in 1858. George, innocently posing beside his brother, could not have imagined he was participating in documenting one of history's most disturbing medical mysteries. His hand, gently resting on Herbert's shoulder, represents not only a farewell gesture, but a final touch between two brothers, one of whom was still silently fighting for life. The cruel irony of the situation is that if Herbert had managed to communicate his state during the initial medical examination, or if the era's diagnostic methods had been more sophisticated, his life could have been preserved. Instead, he became a victim of his era's medical limitations, transforming into a tragic example of how scientific knowledge evolves, often at the cost of human lives. Today, when we observe this historical photograph, we see not only a cultural artifact of the Victorian era, but evidence of a personal tragedy that illustrates human life's fragility and the dangers of assuming we completely understand the fundamental mysteries of existence. Herbert Prescott, in his prolonged and terrifying death, inadvertently became a symbol of humanity's need to question our most basic certainties about life, death, and the liminal states that exist between them. The story of the Prescott brothers reminds us that behind every historical document, every old photograph, and every mystery of the past, real human experiences exist. People who lived, suffered, and faced destinies that challenge our understanding. Herbert Prescott didn't choose to become an object of medical study. He simply experienced a tragedy that transcended his era and continued teaching important lessons to future generations. This is the enduring power of the Prescott brothers photograph. It captures not only a moment in time, but a universal truth about the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of mysteries that continue challenging our understanding of the natural world and human experience. If this story of the Prescott brothers has awakened your interest in the dark mysteries of medical history, consider subscribing to our channel.